So if you've been paying attention to the news at all in the last month, or really even in the past year, then you are aware of a conversation that's taking place nationally and in communities all across our nation regarding the ideas of racial tension, racial justice, and racial reconciliation, or racism in general. So why is that? What's happening in our culture right now? The dominant narrative, if you're listening to news media outlets or social media feeds, it's one of divisiveness. It's not an easy thing to talk about. It's creating division and a breakdown in relationships. And so what's happening? What is it that's causing these conversations to come to the forefront now? And really, what is it that brings racism about anyway? What's the cause? What's the macro level? Well, this week's Group Leader Insights is all about really helping us to start the conversation around racial justice and the gospel. How do we have these conversations in the context of our gospel communities? The reality is we're already having them. We're forced into reacting or talking about these issues because it's what's popular, it's what's on news stations everywhere. So if we're talking about it anyway, let's do so and make sure we're having the right conversation, biblically saturated with the gospel. So what is it that causes racism on a macro level? Really, the idea is sin. Sin is what creates a breakdown in relationships. There's a corruption in our soul that causes us to devalue human life, and that leads to breakdown in human interaction in forms such as murder, abuse, oppression, prejudice, and racism, and many, many other injustices. And so we have a real enemy. The Bible is going to tell us that we have an adversary, the devil, who is bent on destruction. And he uses sin that's sort of inherent. And when sin exposes itself, he uses that to inflame divisiveness, fear, and hatred. So as Christians, we know when the dominant story of our day regarding racial relations is one that is divisive, fearful, and full of hatred, we know that our job isn't to find a side, pick a side, and go to war against the other side. We're not into picking sides when fear and division is the narrative. Instead, we know that we have a very real enemy that's causing these problems. And so we have to step back and realize that our job is to not be defensive, it's to not even be offensive, but redemptive and restorative. And so how do we engage? What is the posture that we're supposed to have? What's our role in this conversation around racial justice, specifically between white and black Americans? Well, the reality is, God has called us to be salt and light. Jesus is going to say that the people of God are salt and that they preserve decay. They keep decay going into death, and so that things are never as bad as they could be, even though they get pretty bad sometimes. Even though they get horribly bad, terrifyingly bad, God uses his people to make sure that things are never getting quite as bad as they can be. We bring restoration and redemption as salt, and we're light. We push back what's darkness. We don't just preserve from decay, but we go into dark spaces and we push back the darkness. We work for justice. We seek justice as the people of God. This is what kingdom citizens do with the light of the gospel. We push back the darkness and work for justice. How do we do that? That's our posture. How do we do that? Jesus is going to say that the whole of the law and the prophets are summarized in this commandment: to love God with your entire being and to love your neighbor as yourself. To love your neighbor. Okay, so as Christians then, what does it look like practically to love, if we're a white American, to love our black American neighbors, to love our brown American neighbors, to love different people from different cultures who might be our neighbors? If you are a black American, what does it look like to love your white American neighbors? What does loving your neighbor look like practically in 2016? And what role do we play as Christians in the racial justice conversation? In order for there to be reconciliation among races, there first has to be Christian people seeking racial justice. That's where the conversation ought to begin. And so we want to provide some resources to help you have this conversation biblically and stay faithful to the gospel, and to have real application, real understanding of how to then to go forth, how to live in light of the gospel when it comes to relationships between white and black Americans and the racism that's been prevalent in that relationship from the inception of our nation. The United States of America is a beautiful place, but there is some baggage. There's a part of our narrative that we need to be honest with and address and approach and come alive to if we're ever going to move forward and be a reconciled people. So here's a caveat. As you go through these resources that our friends at the Verge Network have pulled together for us to consume and to use as discussion pieces, as you go through these resources, especially if you're a part of the white dominant culture, if you've been a part of the majority culture, seek to listen and understand, be slow to be offended and slow to speak and slow to become angry. There are going to be some things that we have to wrestle with, a part that we play in the racial injustice that's plagued our society for decades. While things are better than they ever have been, we still have a long way to go, and we have a part to play in that, and we have to own up to our responsibility. So while some of these conversations may be tough to have, be quick to listen, quick to understand, slow to desire to be understood, and slow to speak and slow to become angry. And if we do that, if we approach this conversation with a posture of gospel humility, I think we just might be able to participate with God in seeing racial justice come to bear in our day. I would love you, praying for you as you have these conversations, and hopefully this is a helpful resource for you. Much love. We'll talk to you later.